okay, I understand that you're angry and take more of a conscious parenting approach? Or are they going to, really say, hey, but this was not okay. You slapping your sister because you were angry, that's not an okay behavior. What happens next? Do they say, when you are angry, it's okay to be angry? Here's what I'd like you to do, or here's what's going to be good in this household.
One of the main characters, his wife had just had a baby, and she was trying the Ferber method, like, her doctor told her to do the Ferber method, and she's standing by the door bawling her eyes out like, "This feels so wrong for me." She ended up going in there and was like, "No, I'm not doing this, like, this doesn't feel right." Hey, everybody, what is going on? It is Bianca.
Welcome back, Evolvers. It's Amelia.
Before we hit record, Emilia and I jumped into the StreamYard, which is where we record these episodes, and we got on the video, and Emilia just looked at me, and she was like, "Are you okay?" Because you could sense it all over my face that I
What's
wasn't
wrong? Yeah.
okay. Like I
Mhm.
I was really struggling, and I was telling you that I had just got off of a really intense client call, and you know, I started like gently crying a little bit when we were talking, and I was saying that like I just feel so deeply for this client, and it brought a lot out, and it brought a lot of like frustration because I just want to help this person so much, and there's been so much injustice done to her, and I'm going through my own, growth phase right now, and just there was a lot of things happening, and you just held space for me as I felt what I was feeling, and you gave me permission to not bottle it up and to just be there with me while I felt it, and then got myself to be able to like move forward with it. And that wasn't something that I was really brought up being taught how to do. I know you weren't taught how to do that, and almost none of our clients, and I guarantee none of our listeners were modeled that and were really taught that of like, "Hey, you're going through something right now. What's
Yeah.
coming up?" And if the person wasn't didn't wanna talk, the other person just holding space for them.
Mhm.
What we're diving into today in the conversation that we're gonna get into is what were we actually taught when we were growing up? What were the things that happened when we did express emotion from infancy up until early childhood, late childhood, preteen, teen, adolescence? How did the people around you deal with and navigate your feelings and their own, and what were the messages taught? Um, Crying it out. It's something that I know you have a lot of strong feelings about, and I have very, very strong feelings about not just like the Ferber method, Gerber method. What is it? Ferber?
I've Gerber
Fer
method, I love
Gerber?
it.
Gerber
It makes
Gerber
sense.
biggie biggie?
Gerber's with babies, right? That's the
The
association pretty
Gerber
close.
babies?
The Ferber method.
Ferber method. I know you have a lot of feelings about that, and I also said one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we talked about too was kind of past infancy and like the response to feelings in total. So we
Yeah.
have um we have a good dialogue ahead of us. So
Yeah.
um what is the Ferber method? And yeah, let's start there. Like what is that for
Yeah,
people who
yeah.
don't know?
So, before I actually go into that, I wanna just celebrate how you actually took opportunity to lean into the space that I created for you. Because when I had said, and this is usually where our as humans, our what's called emotional attunement is actually a lot higher than we give ourselves credit for, which is when you see someone that you love and care about, when you see that they're not okay, for lack of better words, you want to lean in and ask them, and the first thing that you ask is, are you okay? And if someone's asking that, your body, it's called neuroception, you already know that this person's not okay. So for you and I to jump in a space and for me to ask that, the underlying statement is, I know you're not okay.
What's going
Can,
on?
can I hold support for you, right? Can
Yeah.
What can I do, not necessarily to remove your pain, but to help release it just from you experiencing it alone. Right,
Yeah.
because pain isn't a bad thing. Low valence emotions, aka those that aren't great to experience, right? They're not happy, joyful, etc. Those low valence emotions aren't necessarily all that fun to go through, and especially aren't fun to go through alone. And one of the most beautiful thing about, our friendship is that, like, we can see each other. And one of the most beautiful things about humans is that even just sharing in your suffering helps to alleviate it, so that you can carry and integrate it with you and not pathologize the emotion that you're experiencing or the feelings that you're having.
Feeling with someone else suffering is very different than taking on somebody else's suffering. I wanna make sure that we highlight that because
Yeah.
we are not advocating for taking on another person's emotions and, like, the yeah, feeling of obligation of taking on somebody else's experience. It's more so
Mm.
you having the bandwidth within yourself to sit with another person in the suffering that they're experiencing and sitting side by side with them in it,
Yeah, one of the
which is what
things.
you did.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you drawing that distinction, because one of the things as a trauma recovery coach, what a big distinction that you just mentioned in there is the difference between having compassion for someone as opposed to cultivating empathy for someone. When you can cultivate compassion for someone, so like I was compassionate towards your emotional experience and your feeling and your soma, your body being so obvious of like you're feeling like you have to hold it all in.
Mm,
I can have compassion for that because I know what that feels like, and I know that it is so good to express, right? It's so important, it's so healthy, it's so adaptive, it's so conducive to a healthy central nervous system to express
mm.
whatever that suffering is in whatever form that's helpful for you. But if I were to be super empathetic, that means that I would have to put aside my listening skills so that I can take on the burden with you. And what I had done was I was shifting into compassion space to hold and create space with you, which allows me to access my tools as a natural coach would do, in terms of just making sure that we can hold space for that. And that's what is really helpful. Whereas if I were super empathetic with you, I would take on that burden, right? I would maybe shift into problem solving. And I think that's what a lot of people end up doing
Yeah.
unintentionally to this whole conversation around emotions. A lot of us get uncomfortable when someone else is going through discomfort and it's visibly noticeable, right? From facial expression to body contortion, right? It is uncomfortable for someone who you love and care about to go through discomfort. And more often than not, we want to alleviate that suffering and we take it on as our own.
Yeah.
But sometimes that is not what's most conducive. What is most conducive, more often than not, is to actually hold and cultivate a safe space for compassion to exist while
Yeah.
the person going through it, you in this case, can work through it on her own accord. And I think that that's a beautiful bridge to start to begin to answer that question that you had said. And why this topic is actually so important and why I feel so passionate in this and I know you and I have had so many conversations, is because what I was saying to you just before we got on this recording is that the emotions that parents in particular and caregivers and our social systems, let's just say, right? People that you grew up with, the emotions that people don't know how to sit in pretty much that compassionate space and help to regulate and alleviate and express. If there's not that going on, then what do you learn as a young kid? You learn, and this learned behavior gets brought with you throughout adulthood, right? Adolescence, teens, and childhood. You learn that this emotion of maybe sadness, of maybe some grief, right? Of maybe some despair that you were experiencing, knowing what this client had gone through, right? If I wasn't okay in the discomfort of you not being okay, then unconsciously you would be learning to suppress that around me, right? And as young kids, we experience that if you have to go to your room to go cry or go to a corner in timeout to go feel your emotions alone. Whereas
Mhm.
when you're young and you learn that you can't have a emotional experience and still be with someone, over time that ends up suppressing the emotions and it gets stored in our bodies, it gets stored in our belief systems about ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. So that ends up becoming dysfunctional over the compound effect of time.
Right, or that you're only going to be loved if you express quote unquote good emotions. So like the bad emotions, quote unquote, you have to go by yourself, but the good emotions will sit in this room with you and
Mhm.
experience it with you. So it's like the
Right.
message that a lot of my clients, and I know you say the same thing, a lot of our clients say, you know, our parents, whenever we were crying or whenever we were struggling, go to your room. And when you're, you know, a good girl, a good boy, whatever, or when you're done feeling whatever it is that that is, then you can
Mhm.
come out and come back with us. So you're basically taught from a young age,
Mhm.
my emotions are bad. My emotions are not valid. I'm not going to receive love if
Mhm.
I'm having real feelings. And then the narrative ends up becoming, oh, feelings are bad. Emotions are bad. I'm only going to be loved if I have good emotions, and nobody's going to tolerate me if I
Mhm.
experience any other types of emotions, which is why as adults, we really struggle allowing people to get all of us. Meaning,
Mhm.
like, we really struggle holding our feelings in front of other people. We really struggle not being okay in front of other people, which is why, like, a lot of the times when people ask, "Are you okay?" Or like, you're like, "Yeah, I'm fine.
Right, that's the
I'm
just gut
fine."
reaction.
Right. Because we don't know how to hold space for other people because nobody really did it for them. So it's like, how are you going to know how to then do it for somebody else? Feelings are bad. The social narrative is feelings are bad, aka the low valence emotions that you're talking about.
Mhm.
So when those are bad, hide them, stuff them away, and only come out when you're presentable.
Exactly. Which is to the point that you had said to where the question that you had given me comes in, which is
Mhm.
who in your world when you were younger had modeled actually holding space for low valence emotions? So if you were I gave the example to you just before we jumped on where if you're, let's say for example a toddler and all of a sudden you experience anger, right? You're not necessarily aware of that anger. You're starting to learn your own emotions. You're starting to learn yourself, but let's say, for example, this toddler gets really angry and slaps his little sister because his sister took his toy, right? That's a very like common thing that can happen. But what is a parent or caregiver, anyone who's observing that, what do they do in that? Are they just going to, put that kid in timeout? Are they going to separate the emotion? Okay, I understand that you're angry and take more of a conscious parenting approach. Or are they going to, really say, hey, but this was not okay. You slapping your sister because you were angry, that's not an okay behavior. What happens next? Do they say, when you are angry, it's okay to be angry? Here's what I'd like you to do, or here's what's going to be good in this household, right? Like, and from a not necessarily a good or bad, but like really, what are the productive behaviors that are socially acceptable and that don't harm other people when you're in these low valence states? So when you're angry, what
Mhm.
is a behavior that a toddler at that time can go and do or be in and do
Right.
to navigate that? So, for example, right, when you're angry, that's okay. That's totally okay. Let's start our breath work, right? How young are you training your children to navigate the emotional regulation tactics? And how are you modeling that yourself? So, let's bring in the question around modeling and what the Ferber method is to this episode podcast of Cried Out, right? So, this is something that I often come across, like I had said, especially with male clients, because a lot of the emotional history or history when it comes to child development and adolescent psychology, a lot of that isn't necessarily, shall we say, front and center of people's minds. And when you are, let's say, for example, a 34-year-old male, I have one client in particular, and you're having difficulties with, the aftermath of a breakup, and you don't feel as though you can turn towards your friends, you don't feel like you can turn towards your family. You have
Mhm.
all big emotions, right? Maybe this is one of your first relationships that were actually really serious. Like, what do you do with all those big emotions? Where do you go? Do you just shove it down and try to carry on and be busy, which is what everyone else's advice is? Or are you reaching out to a coach or therapist to try to navigate the waters of that? Usually, what you do is based on what you learned, how to navigate difficult experiences. And that
Mhm.
comes back down to when you were a blob, when you were a little blob screaming and crying who had come out of the womb. And why I mention that is because what a lot of the scientific literature points to when it comes to when you are born into the world, way back, let's just go back into like the 1890s. There was who was called the father of pediatrics, Dr. Holt. And Dr. Holt's work essentially came into parents' world because there was a study that was published where he endorsed what's called this method of sleep training. So when your infant is screaming and crying, by the way, screaming and crying for needs that need to go met, like close proximity to a caregiver, like being fed or needing to go to the bathroom and work through gastrointestinal issues, because you can't do that as an infant yourself, right? When your child is screaming and crying in their crib or wherever, what ultimately came through as being trained to the parents of the world, what ultimately came through was to let them cry it out. So
Mhm.
a lot of parents learned, quote unquote, that method, which kind of falls underneath like sleep training, and it's known as like the extinction method clinically. But ultimately, that was the theory of, if you do that with your infant, they're going to learn how to self soothe. So they're going to learn that if they experience an emotion or discomfort for being hungry, or an emotion being scared because the caregiver walked away, all of those emotions, that letting your child cry it out, and something like, for example, if you hear the scream, wait 3 hours until you actually go comfort your infant. That type of mentality was introduced as the CIO method for parenting. That was like the Bible of parenting, what you should do with a child. Now, what does that teach a child? And why does the Ferber method matter? Because the Ferber method was actually um, essentially built on top of that. If you let
Mhm.
your children cry it out, they're going to, right? This was the belief. They're going to be able to learn how to self soothe.
They're gonna be independent.
They're going to be independent. They won't need you. What's wild about how inaccurate the science was, and I just think it's freaking ironic at the fact that it was actually a father of pediatrics that published this and set the tonality for how caregiving and child development is, right? If you're not watching YouTube, Bianca and I are eye rolling. It wasn't the mother of pediatrics, right? The ones who birth the child and usually are the ones who are raising them, but I digress. The Ferber method was kind of, not 100 years later, but essentially like around the 1970s, when psychologists and pediatrics really realized that, this cried out method, although in theory it sounds really good, what that was teaching infants, and then that developed into toddlers and adolescents, and carried throughout their lives. A lot of people were experiencing wild neglect, and actually that cried out method has since been phased into a neglectful aspect of parenting, because what that actually does to your child is that induces even more stress hormones, so it actually does the complete opposite. The kid's less likely to cry, not because you removed yourself and let them cry it out, but because their central nervous system has gotten into an overload state to where their body goes into a dorsal vagal shutdown, which means I need to collapse and be quiet because otherwise I'm going to die. Like, that is the tiny little narrative that's
Mhm.
coming through in this little infant. Now, the Ferber method, 1970s. Boring, Amelia, I know, but this is super important. Ferber method on top of that essentially echoed from the mountaintops of not only is it important for your child to cry it out and for you as a parent to encourage that, right? And like under the guise of sleep training and how you as a parent need to kind of figure out how to navigate this. But on top of that, it was like, oh, yeah, 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 no, on top of letting children cry it out, this is actually good for the parents and to do this in specific time intervals. So it's not just when the child needs sleep, but it's doing this like a regimen. And so let them cry it out. That was the encouragement. That, guys and gals, translated to a whole lot of generations not knowing how to actually self-soothe, not learning how to regulate their own central nervous system in a healthy adaptive way that isn't stress inducing. So now fast forward, why does that
Well,
how does that
not
impact?
only that oh, okay, I think you were about to just say it, but
No, jump in. Go.
well, not only that, but it also teaches you that nobody's gonna be there for you when you're struggling. So you learn from a very young age, the world isn't safe, my primary caregivers are not gonna take care of me,
Yeah.
I have to go it alone, and the work on attachment theory was what really set the tone for all of this, and it was like, "Guys, this is so wrong.
Yeah.
This is actually destroying these children, and it's making them worse off
Mm-mm.
in the future. It's making them have unstable relationships and be unstable
Yeah.
within their own world." Like, I remember I don't know if you ever watched Full House, but there was an episode of Full House when one of the main characters, his wife had just had a baby, and
Mm.
she was trying the Ferber method, like, her doctor told her to do the Ferber method, and
Oh,
she's
yeah.
standing by the door bawling her eyes out like, "This feels so wrong for me."
'Cause it
And I think
is.
at the end of the yeah, it is wrong. And at the end of the episode, I think she ended up going in there and was like, "No, I'm not doing this, like, this doesn't feel right," or something like that, but
Yeah, because it isn't like, scientifically and developmentally, it's not right. It actually increases the stress hormones within the mother, which then the child actually mirrors, and it just creates this vicious, toxic upward spiral or downward spiral of, chronic stress and poor communication and poor attachment bonds. So it has been discounted. It's quite fascinating.
well, not only that, when the mother's stress levels are increased, it taints her hormones, which impacts her milk production. So when
Not
if
on
we're really
only on
about
top
to
of
get
that,
into the nitty-gritty, like, it impacts the milk that the mother is producing, which then the baby is
it's
literally
less
eating, so the
nutrient
baby is
dense.
literally eating tainted
Right.
milk.
Not only that, but on top of that, you have on top of this right now, actually recently, finally, some of the data that I have been saying the whole time is gonna finally be there, and we're gonna be like, "Oh, no way." Women's brains are actually wildly impacted as they go through pregnancy. And so not only that, but you have a already stressed out mom whose brain is wildly changing and impacting her ability to be her best self, right? Like in terms of gray matter and white matter, it actually does it I won't go into that, but like there's so much. So between the tainting of the milk, right? Picture milk with a crap ton of stress hormones injected into your baby, like, how do you think that's gonna establish a well foundation central nervous system? And then on top of that, there's no external, comfort that comes your way while you're an infant screaming and crying because you need food. It's not like, "Oh, I'm hungry, and I have decided that this, you know, I you know what? I just want a snack right now." Like, infants aren't doing that. Infants are trying to like, their systems are trying to develop them into a wildly functioning creature in this world. And if that one need, that scream or cry, is being denied external comfort from a caregiver because of the fact that this a male of pediatrics in the 1890s said it was a good idea, like, how dumb, how ignorant, and how wildly bad is that? It's
W
it's literally neglect. So,
Yeah.
Again,
Go down a rabbit hole about all the
we will. I'm gonna come back up.
stupid people in history who have just given horrible advice, and it was just so faulty. Like, don't get me started on Freud and trauma, 'cause he
My
did
goodness.
damage, but we talked a lot of theory in this episode. How is this relevant to all of you?
Mhm.
I hope that everyone listening to this is able to see that when you're taught as a child, when you're taught as an adolescent, as an infant, as a child, growing up with people around you who can't tolerate your emotions because it triggers their own and they don't know how to deal with it.
Like
You become an
self-regulating.
adult, you become an adult who is not capable of emotionally regulating. You become an adult who feels like your emotions are not valid and they're wrong and they're bad, and you actually should shame them and shove them away. And that does more and more and more damage. And that's why we started with the story that we did, because having a safe space to be able to adaptively express your emotions with someone who you feel safe with is so critical. If I didn't have that open space to be able to dive into this before we dove into this episode, like, I wouldn't have been okay the rest of the day.
Yeah.
And now granted, it's okay not to be okay, but, like, that might have impacted my ability to do the rest of my day.
Yeah.
So
So true.
having someone safe to talk to, having a safe space where your emotions are recognized and validated and you are loved no matter what the emotion is that you're experiencing. It makes a huge difference. One of the other really big disrupting elements of all of this is you're also taught bad emotions equal bad behavior. And that's also another reason why you're pushed into your room by yourself so
Right.
that you don't quote unquote like disrupt anything.
Mhm.
Emotions do not inherently lead to behavior.
Mhm.
But when we're taught, I can't get angry because I can't control myself. I can't be sad because I can't control myself. That's when emotions even further start becoming they feel like this really damaging and overwhelming element that they're not. Emotions in and of themselves are not bad.
Mm.
How you react to your emotions, the behaviors that you are unconsciously choosing based on your emotions. That's what's quote unquote bad. And having safe spaces to express these feelings is what allows you to then feel even further in control of your emotions and therefore of your behavior.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's like the go-to response or reaction rather, because the difference between reaction and response is you when you react, you don't actually have a conscious choice in the matter, right? There's no like self-led aspect of like, let me weigh the consequences of this behavior as opposed to this one. Which one's better
It's
for like what
impulsive.
ultimately, right? There's no conscious choosing in that. So like, for example, I have a client that comes to mind where it's like when her family, what was modeled when someone's angry, and it was specifically her dad that modeled this for everyone else, but when dad is angry, you're going to slap something, you're going to slap someone, you're going to throw something, there's some type of physical violence that gets injected into the equation, and so that becomes the formula that is now this client's well, was, right, we're working on this, but when anger comes up, there's like a central nervous system automatic reaction that wants to go slap something, right? So now it's like, okay, do I trust myself when this emotion, to your point, comes up? And the answer usually becomes no, because all you have, for lack of better words, the tools in your tool belt when that emotion comes up is just go and slaps or hit someone or hit something or punch a hole in the wall, right? And that's where the value of really being able to be connected with someone who has the ability to expand your emotional intelligence, your emotional coping skills, the skills and strategies and tools of regulation and reassociations and thought patterns that are affiliated with all of this stuff, recognizing like, whoa, shoot, my family grew up in that era where not only was the crying it out method and the Ferber method of child development, like the end all be all Bible of how my parents operated. But now I recognize through this episode that I have no way to cope with some of those low valence emotions like anger, frustration, guilt, um, any sort of like really challenging emotions. That is your sign. This is your sign to reach out for help and to recognize that if you don't do this work, it's gonna follow you for your entire life. To the sentiment that I've heard from my client, the one, who had come to me and said, "I don't necessarily feel safe with my friends because they have this vantage point of emotions. They think that I should just do X, Y, and Z, keep busy, whatever," right? And post breakup, right, there's a lot of big emotions that are underneath that. So they connect to so many other things. Are you gonna cope in maladaptive ways? He said, "I'm so grateful that I have this space because Emilia, like no one in my town, not to mention my family or friend group, knows any of this stuff. And even worse, are trying to know this stuff. Everyone's just wash, rinse, repeat in this small town. Everyone's just trying to, look out for their own. And we have this old, outdated mentality that is literally like just from the grandmothers and grandfathers been passed down without anyone questioning and saying, hey, this isn't actually helpful. This isn't actually adaptive. And I just see these cycles perpetuating. So, for those cycle breakers that are listening to this episode and hearing this stuff come up, you are not alone, far from alone, as a matter of fact.
We are here to help guide you through that. If and when, you're ready to take that leap, we all need somebody to talk to. We all need somebody to help us learn some of these skills that our parents didn't teach us. The client that I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, I'm sincerely so glad that she and I are now working together because I know that through our work, she's going to, have a better quality of life because she finally has somebody who can be there for her. And she said it herself, like, I'm so glad that I now have this. I was really scared to invest in therapy. And, I'm really glad that I took the leap because I really need help and I was afraid to admit it. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are also really scared to take that leap and to ask for help and to admit that not everything is okay. And that is okay. Like, it's okay to be scared. It's okay to have the feelings that you have. Don't let your life continue to suffer because of them, though. And
Yeah.
so we have so many opportunities for everybody in the Evolve community, including the You Do You program. Not everybody's ready to jump on a Zoom call once a week or once every 2 weeks. So even just having someone that you can privately message in a secure space that, it's like therapy. It's all through messaging. Like, it's a safe space for you to have somewhere to go whenever you need it. So if that's something that you're interested in, the link is in the description of allventurestech.com/therapy, or you can send us a DM and we'll get you started. But
Yeah.
nobody should have to suffer through their emotions alone and suffer through their experiences alone. And, this podcast is one platform for that. And there's also so many ways that you can get help. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Mm. As a matter of fact, I encourage everyone to reach out in some degree after listening to this episode because not doing so is just not fair to you. You know, there's, like I said, it's caused a generational ripple effect of some of the really damaging and ill-informed um, old science, right? And old psychology. So we have new data, we have new science, we have new studies that some amazing, courageous people who have reached out for help have helped contributed to. So take a chance on yourself, take a chance on your family, and all the people that you impact. So in closing, my episode suggestion for anyone that liked this episode and want to kind of carry on that journey of exploration between Bianca and I's. The one that I would suggest would be 110, Why Don't I Feel Good Enough? So click that episode if you want to learn the connection point between that episode and this one. B, yours?
316, do you feel abandoned? Have a wonderful week, everyone. We know this was a heavy hitter, so please take some take some space for you after listening to this, and we will see you next time. Bye everybody.